It seems Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 0 share one thing in common: a train going too fast and about to hit a giant wall. The hype train surrounding the Resident Evil 4 remake is overwhelming, to say the least. It's a bit of a struggle these days to not get carried away by the excitement of unforeseen novelties within a franchise held near and dear to the heart, even if it gets clearer by the minute that stoicism these days is the essential key to not fall prey to the extreme cynicism that has consumed what were once enthusiastic Resident Evil fans. So before we proceed with the video, just make sure to keep the expectations quite in check for this one. Everything discussed from this moment forward is purely speculation. So this week Capcom revealed a clock counting down the days and hours towards a supposedly new announcement. The question is, what game will it be? Is it the one that everybody thinks it is? At this point in time, there's no telling if this video will hit the bullseye or, age like a carton of milk at a sauna. But let's try to deduce and narrow down what the announcement could actually be. Let's get the unlikely candidates out of the way. One of them is Pragmata. This game was delayed till 2023 now instead of 2022 just a few months ago, so an announcement, let alone a huge-ass countdown, would seem unlikely. Up next, Resident Evil 3, the Nemesis edition. If you came across my Resident Evil 3 video essay on the channel, it's no secret that I wish for a Nemesis edition announcement as much as the next guy. With the Studio M2 no longer involved in the Resident Evil 4 remake project, there's a sliver of hope that the studio's schedule has been freed up just enough to return to work on improving Resident Evil 3 if all the Steam updates are of any indication. That being said, I just don't really see it happening. Not at this point in time. I wouldn't mind being wrong though. I suspect a new Monster Hunter game is also not in the cards yet, given that Rise just came out for the PC. I also don't think Dead Rising is rising from the undead anytime soon. Moving on to the more probable announcements, first contender is Street Fighter 6. The countdown seems to conclude on the same day that the Street Fighter 5 tournament ends. Of all the possible candidates on this list, this one is in the top 3 for me, and I suspect the most probable announcement that isn't Resident Evil related. But before we get to those, up next we have Devil May Cry 6. It has been a while since Devil May Cry 5, and given the excellent return to form with that one, this could be as good a time as any to announce the undoubtedly anticipated sequel. Now moving on to Resident Evil related announcements, up first let's talk about the Resident Evil Village DLC. This was announced at last year's E3 with little to no information, other than the fact that it was about to enter the production stage. It would actually make sense to announce it now, and here's why. Village has been out for almost a year now. That is most likely enough development time for an expansion big enough to warrant a countdown for itself, but not big enough to warrant an E3 presentation. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this is what the announcement is for. Here are the last 2 suspected announcements before we get to the big one. Resident Evil Revelations 3. This game has been in the discourse for quite some time, rumored to be a Switch exclusive that supposedly sees the return of Rebecca Chambers as a protagonist. For a while it was referred to as Resident Evil Outrage, but it seems that one is an entirely unrelated multiplayer game that may or may not have gotten cancelled. Speaking of multiplayer games that should get cancelled, up next is Resident Evil Verse, or RE4 in short. This one was supposed to release with Resident Evil Village, but ended up getting postponed indefinitely. And frankly, it's probably best to just scrap the whole premise and just make Outbreak File 3 at this point. Now onto the big one, the real reason why you're here, probably. So, is it finally time to reveal the remake of Resident Evil 4? Everybody knows that a Resident Evil 4 remake is coming. I know it, you know it, at this point even Jon Snow knows it. This is the trickiest announcement to determine by far due to how volatile Capcom announcements tend to be. Honestly, they can be anything from the best E3 trailers of, say, the last 10 years, if not of all time, especially Resident Evil 7 and RE2 Remake trailers, and then you have something like E3 from last year. An event so underwhelming you'd wonder why they didn't just summarize it in a tweet, if even that. There's just not enough consistency throughout the last few years to say that this announcement is a definite one, but let's just for a minute entertain the idea of it happening. If you observe the gaming industry for long enough, you'll start to notice some patterns. Patterns of leaks that turn out to be correct, and also patterns of leaks that turn out to be absolute dog shit. The past couple of months, Resident Evil 4 Remake became a prominent topic on YouTube, prominent enough for even a channel like mine to get carried away for a moment and pulled into the discourse for the simple reason that I adore Resident Evil 4 and I just can't help myself. It's a game so brimming with exceptional concepts that for a Resi fan like myself, even the discarded gameplay and thematic ideas are still worth bringing up to this day. Because of this fascination that I have with the game, I'm constantly up to date with the remake rumor mill. What's interesting is that the Resident Evil 4 Remake leaks are no longer a small niche as they used to be. This week in particular, it wasn't just the Resident Evil fans on YouTube who were talking about it, even the mainstream media came out with some information. This, to me, is an important detail that stands out from the rest. So here's one of the patterns that I was alluding to. Most gaming stories or breaking news just seem to happen always in time for an imminent announcement and an inevitable hype train. The mainstream media said something particularly interesting. The Resident Evil 4 Remake is to be announced early 2022. And since it just so happens to be early 2022, and there's a countdown I've never seen Capcom do before, at least not to my recollection, it does beg the question, would they really need a countdown in the first place if the announcement wasn't of an astounding magnitude? That was point number 1, but I want to add one more. Let's take a look at another pattern, shall we? We know for a fact that ever since the soft reboot with Resident Evil 7, every Resident Evil game since has come out within less than a year after announcement. It's also worth noting that Resident Evil is now an annual franchise, therefore, unless the Resident Evil Village DLC is big enough to count as a standalone game, that would mean there's another Resident Evil title that is still waiting to be announced. Resident Evil 4 Remake will probably have a similar release window, and here's why. There is a huge competitor this year, the Dead Space Remake, which is also supposedly coming late 2022. The original Dead Space released around Halloween season, so we could be looking at the same release window for both remakes. Now, get this, if Resident Evil 4 gets announced at the end of the countdown, it lines up with Dead Space's release window around Halloween. Keep in mind, both of these are legendary survival horror games that explored new territory within the medium and the genre, and they are revered all around the world, and the industry itself. From that angle, it would make total sense if the two remakes of the pioneers of the modern survival horror ended up fighting for the same release window. What a time we live in. Anyway, those were my thoughts about the whole Capcom countdown and the Resident Evil 4 remake potentially appearing there. Now I'd like to know what you think. What do you think this countdown's about, and what could be in store? Let me know. Until then, hope for the best and expect nothing. And with that, this skeptical yet optimistic Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.